from Tufts University, a master's in religion and bioethics from Harvard, an MD from Duke, and a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management from Oxford University. So quite the pedigree here. And I also just found out, well, first of all, when were you at Duke?
Duke 2007 to 11.
So we overlapped in North Carolina for about 5 years, which I did not realize before just then, because I was at UNC. And we also have another thing in common, that we were both science and technology policy fellows at the National Academies, though at different times for that one.
Really pitched for that one.
Yeah, it's a great program. Christine Mears Zion Science and Technology Policy Fellowship.
So good.
Which you can qualify for after a master's. And Timothy has worked as an environment and ocean specialist at World Bank, and he founded a global program on climate change and health at the World Bank, which he now leads. He has published several articles on very interesting topics like One Health and climate and health, and he also recently contributed to the Lancet Countdown report on climate and health. So I think he's got a really interesting background that he's going to share with us today, and I look forward to your talk. And I think I will sit in this.
All right. Hey, everybody. Good crowd. Excellent. So who is in the room? Who is an environmental person? Okay, most people. What about health people? There's some overlap there. Yeah. Anybody else? Economists? That's good. Okay. Good. Actually, nice to have that changed. Scientists, like research scientists. That's not environment. Okay. All right. What else am I missing? Okay, well, that's good. All right, a lot of environmental health people. Excellent.
We're in a bubble.
Great. We've got a really nice building here, so thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. I've worked with Susan in the past. She has done some excellent work for the bank and with the bank, so huge asset. It's really nice to have this collaboration with universities, because working over there, we're focused on getting money out the door and working with developing countries, but we also need to have a brain trust to draw upon. And so, working with people like Susan that are doing really cutting-edge research, we can build that into our projects and make our projects better. So if any of you are so inspired to come and work for an international institution, you can do that and still not completely neglect your work activity. So I am just going to tell you a little bit today about our work at the World Bank on climate change and health and environmental health more broadly. How many of you know what the World Bank is? Probably yes, broadly. Has anyone worked for the World Bank? Okay. Has anyone in the room worked in climate change and health specifically? Okay, cool. And then of course many other dimensions of environmental health. All right, so what I'll do is I'll just give you an overview of some of the climate change and health issues that are happening globally, international context, and then dive in deeper to the work of the World Bank and then how that might relate with some of what you're doing. So let's see if I can make this work. No. All right. So I'm just going to start with a quick video. It's a couple of minute overview of climate change and health impacts. And you've probably seen this sort of thing before, you know about what climate and health impacts are. But I think it's just a good contextualization.
Climate change, the range of extreme health, resulting in lots of extreme weather like droughts, floods, and heat waves. But it will also damage the ecosystem, resulting in more polluted air, decreased crop yields, and undernutrition, and threatening our supply of clean drinking water. Climate change will bring social change. As sea levels rise, mass human migration will lead to overcrowding, pressure on scarce resources, and possibly violent conflict. Heat waves can be fatal for people aged 65 and over. This exposure will increase over the next century. But demographic data shows populations are migrating and aging into areas worst affected by climate change, and the true exposure increase for the over 65s is likely to be even greater. The current global energy mix, which emphasises fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas, has a profound impact on human health. As well as exacerbating climate change, fossil fuels are already causing heart and lung disease directly through poor air quality. The long-term effects from fossil fuels on global climate change will have even greater and more far-reaching effects on human health. But the news isn't all bad. This diagram lays out many of the key responses to climate change, all of which have significant co-benefits for human health. Low-carbon vehicles and active transport like walking and cycling decrease air pollution and carbon emissions, and also decrease obesity and cardiovascular disease. In fact, through these co-benefits, and by preventing the potential loss to economic development, responding to climate change could be the biggest global health opportunity of this century. Most people view climate change as a threat, but there's significant variation. Over 70% of the population in Brazil, South Korea and Greece understand that climate change is a major threat, compared to 40% or less in the USA and China. Trends of parts per million CO2 emissions are difficult to appreciate, but increasing asthma rates or exacerbating childhood undernutrition are tangible health problems that people relate to. Whether we respond to climate change, turning the threat it poses into an opportunity to improve public health, is no longer a question of scientific evidence or technological capability. It is now entirely a matter of political commitment. The health profession has a vital role to play in driving this transition, communicating the risks and ensuring climate change policies promote public health. We need to be at the forefront of this issue, helping to create a healthier future.
Right, excellent. So I quite like that video, in spite of like the CPR music. But it's
In the words of the World Health Organization's Director General, climate change is the defining health issue of the 21st century.
so much climate change in health media out there. You can see I'm not used to using A3C. Okay. There we go. All right, so I really like that video because I think it's a good representation of what the climate and health impacts are, but it's also presented in such a way that people can understand, right? So communication is a really important part of this. But then also the Lancet has done this interesting thing in the past few years. They've shifted from talking about climate change and health impacts and problems to solutions and opportunities. And you know, there's a trend to do this in all sorts of environmental issues, but I think it's important because it enables understanding. And it helps people understand, you know, how this connects to their work and the kind of impact they can be having within their institutions to achieve some kind of real change. This is just another representation of that. There are a number of these diagrams out there which have been used over the past 10, 15, 20 years to explain how it's all connected. This one I think is interesting because it sort of leads you to what the impacts are. So you understand that there are all of these different pathways starting with climate change that have an impact on human health. And this is just another representation of that. And this one is more useful to look at. This is from the IPCC report, chapter 12 or 13 on human health. And it sort of focuses on these pathways and direct exposures, indirect exposures, and economic and social disruption. And working within an institution like the World Bank, it's useful to think about that because we can put investment into these buckets rather than investment into addressing direct health impacts, which may be more useful for a health organization. So the next couple minutes I'm going to talk about the international context of climate change and health, how the World Bank fits into this, and how we play with all the other kids in the playground. If anybody has questions or comments, by all means just interrupt me. It's a seminar. I'm happy to discuss. So these are some of our partners in this landscape. You can see there's universities, there's other international organizations, there's research institutes, there's foundations. The landscape of climate change and health partners is broad. We just had lunch with some of the students and we were discussing this, you know, potential career paths. There are many ways to get at this. And universities have comparative advantages to international organizations, to foundations. But the reality is you need a lot of different folks working on these issues because the problems are so intractable. And without having funders and researchers and policymakers, your impact is not going to be as much as it could if it's not collective. So we try to stay as engaged with these folks as we can. And we do this, of course, through conferences and just daily phone calls, see who's doing what and where they're doing it. International momentum on climate change and health has really picked up over the past decade or so. The global discourse has been around since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, when a group of physicians went down to Rio, took out a full page ad in the New York Times, really advocating for climate change and health issues. And since then, momentum has been slow, but in the past 5-7 years, you've got global leadership beginning to adopt these concepts. So you've got Mark Chan and Tedros, the two most recent DGs of WHO, Christina Figueres and Patricia Espinosa, who both head up the UNFCCC. And these two organizations now are working quite closely on this issue, and Tedros is actually coming to the World Bank in a couple of months for World Bank spring meetings, which is one of our 2 annual big meetings where we bring in finance ministers and heads of state and have a meeting with World Bank presidents to discuss these issues and hopefully coalesce some more global support for it. Recently, these are just some of the international actions that have taken place. So there was a World Health Assembly resolution in 2008 on climate and health. That was probably the beginning of this past decade of strong climate change and health movement. You got all of these health ministers together saying, look, this is critically important. We need a resolution on it to raise the profile for it. Some people might say, well, it's just a resolution, it's really that interesting. But what that does is it creates some of the enabling environment for other funders to move in and for academics to get their research funded. They can cite a resolution. They're applying to foundations or government funding sources and so on. UN Security Council then picked this up, which is pretty interesting because they carry a whole different kind of weight and they play with different folks. And so getting defense ministers and heads of state thinking about it that way is really critical as well. And then the EU has gotten involved, the WHO has had these health and climate conferences, and then there's just a ton of foundations and governments and multilateral organizations that are really beginning to think about this stuff. Also, Sustainable Development Goals, everybody knows what these are? Right, so health and climate are fundamental to this. You look at the SDGs, there's 17 of them. This many are specifically about human health or about environment. And then the other ones, are necessarily about these things. It's just not explicitly stated. So I think there's real alignment here between the broader UN Sustainable Development Goals and connecting climate change and health and environmental issues. And if you're going to do anything within the UN system or with other international organizations, it's really critical to tie that back to the SDGs because that's the blueprint for sustainable development in the future. There's also a lot of increasing demand from countries, and this comes in different ways. There are coalitions. There's an organization called Clim Health Africa, which is a consortium of, I think it's 20 or 23 African nations who have come together for purposes of research and policy making to raise awareness for climate and health issues, but also to collaborate on scientific issues. There was the Libreville Declaration on Health and Environment in Africa way back in 2008, and that was more broad than just climate and health. And then this is just the assembly of the WHO, health ministers there getting together to discuss climate change and health. So developing countries or developed countries say, look, this is an issue, we want to be working on this. Developing countries will ask the World Bank or other financing institutions for resources, financial or technical, and then it's our job to respond and say, yes, we can address these issues. This is just an illustration of some of the large-scale climate change and health adaptation projects that are happening in the world right now. And these are only WHO projects. If you throw our projects on there, you probably have twice as many. In 2 years' time, you'll have 4 times as many. But it's just to show that there are projects that are happening all around the world to address health and climate impacts. And then this is the Lancet. Has everyone read this report? Has anyone read this report? Yeah, okay, a few. So there was 2 versions of this. There was the 2008 Lancet Special Commission on Health and Climate Change, and that articulated what the challenges were. And then in 2015, there were the opportunities report. And then subsequent to that, there is the Lancet Countdown, just tracking progress on health and climate change. So looking at a number of different indicators to show how the world and the policy sphere is working on health and climate change. And if we are, in fact, getting better, awareness is increasing, investments are moving. And so they've got these 5 different categories of indicators. And me, as a representative of the World Bank, sit with this group, and we meet a couple of times a year to reassess and discuss. And then if we're seeing areas where we're not making progress, it is to then go back to policymakers and lean on them and say, look, we need more work in this area. But it's a really cool thing that's funded by the Wellcome Trust. I'll just leave that up for a second and let you read it. So this is from the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, the Climate Accord. And I put this up, it's one of the first paragraphs of the entire agreement. And I think it's so critical, right? Because this is the paragraph that's about humans. It's about children and persons with disabilities, and it's about health. The accord itself is 30 pages long. There's all sorts of stuff in there about biodiversity and carbon pricing and environment and so on. But it's this that's right up front that gets to the heart of this. And this, even though it might seem like it's just a few words, is really quite significant because it comes right at the beginning of the Paris Accord, and it contextualizes the whole thing. Also, it's been many years coming that health would be incorporated into this document, and there's a lot of pushback for various reasons. Making a document like this, having to agree on the words and the precise language when you've got 180 plus stakeholders in the room is incredibly difficult. But fortunately, we're able to get health in here. And now that it is, we can see that other organizations are using it. The WHO has just appointed a new Assistant Director General for Health and Climate Change. Foundations are starting to fund this space. And people are using this kind of language in their grant programming because you can use it to get money and do research. There's the World Bank just down the street. We all know where this is. This is where we work. We work in the red, orange, and sometimes yellow countries. So every continent of the world except Antarctica. Just give you a quick overview of how the World Bank was set up. So we were established after World War II to help rebuild Europe. France was actually our first country. And the reason, of course, that France had some issues after World War II. In the 1950s then, particularly focused on physical infrastructure building, bridges, dams, so on. The 1960s, we shifted focus and began working more on rural development. Got Africa in the mix, Asia. 1970s, began working on human development issues, social systems, health and well-being. 1980s, really got involved in financial markets and started working with the IMF. 1990s, a bit of a shift back to social development programs again, similar to the sort of the health focus in the 1970s. 2000s, it was about institution building up government, trying to prevent conflict. 2010s, where we are now, it's about these global goods agendas and working with other international agreements. This is where the SDGs come in, new work on gender, and of course, climate change. So that's where we are now. And what do we do? Well, we really do 3 primary things. We develop analytics, so reports. Did I bring those here? I don't know, maybe there's reports around. I mean, you've all seen a World Bank report, right? So you know what this looks like. And those come in different flavors. There's, of course, all the economics work, but then there's subject area work, the stuff that I've worked on and Susan's worked on, focusing on air pollution, environment, and climate. We lend. We give out a lot of money in grants and loans. And I'll discuss that more in just a moment, and then we convene to bring people together. We are an anchor here in Washington, D.C., for this kind of work, but also around the world. We can get on the phone, get a bunch of finance ministers together, and connect them with environment ministers, or transport ministers, or heads of state, or whatever, to get to the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for. So this is a bit about our structure and how much money we lend. So there are these 5 different groups within the World Bank. IBRD and IDA are the 2 that have to deal with money to developing countries. And that's about 41 billion a year. IFC, which is just across the street here, International Finance Corporation, is the group that deals with private sector organizations in developing countries. So this sort of chunk of 41 billion goes to governments themselves. This chunk of 17 billion goes to private sector organizations in developing countries. And then there's this one here, which does insurance-y stuff that I don't really understand. And then there's this one, which handles disputes and are rumored to have Black Hawk helicopters and will go and enforce loans that go bad. And the amount of money is a little bit different every year. It's somewhere between 50, 60, 70, 80 billion dollars. It increases every year as well. And I think this year we've got the biggest commitment on in history. This is the way that we're set up. We've got these different departments that we call global practices, which are thematic. So energy, environment and natural resources, education, agriculture, health, of course. And then we got these cross-cutting solution areas which go across the entire institution, of which climate change is one. And so the work that I do focuses on the health and nutrition global practice and the climate change group that goes across. So even though my work is focused right here in this global silo of health and nutrition, it cuts across all the others necessarily. Climate-related health impacts underlie the World Bank's twin goals, which are reducing poverty and increasing shared prosperity. Both of these are important, and they're not exactly the same. There's a lot of nuance that goes into each of these, and there's a lot of time spent in developing them. But it's about making poor people less poor, and then bringing them into the global marketplace. So, development impacts of health and climate change. I'm going too fast to just stop me. I'm just going to fly through these. We've got like 8 slides. So I'm trying not to spend too long on each one. So this is just, again, sort of some of the health and climate impacts and how this connects to people, right? So increasing diarrheal burden, may increase by 10% in some regions by 2030. By end of the century, that might even be higher. You have a couple hundred million people that have an increased disease burden, diarrheal disease burden, particularly in Southeast Asia and particularly children. Of course, this vector-borne disease story is well known as temperatures increase. Malaria, dengue, chikungunya, we're already seeing shifts, are going to shift more. And you say, all right, well, it's going to shift into some new areas and shift away from others. Okay, fine. The problem is the areas that it's shifting into have populations who haven't had to deal with it before, and so the impacts are going to be more strongly felt. And then, of course, there's this narrative around food, right? Malnutrition, and then, of course, as we're interested in the World Bank as well, the economies associated with that, food prices, and all the other social dynamics that are related with health and environment and food issues. So, again, this is just contextualizing the World Bank in this universe of other development agencies. So there's, a dozen or so other multilateral banks, and so we're just one player. And then also there are these other overseas development agencies. A lot of the developed countries in the world have departments that provide a lot of resources to developing countries. In 2015, which is the latest year that we got data for, there was about $81 billion committed in climate finance. So this represents, $500 billion worth of development aid. Of that, 81 billion was somehow linked to climate change. Yeah.
Can you define what you mean by development? I guess from the perspective of the bank.
Yeah, sure. So, development is about working with the developing countries, as so articulated by the World Bank's income stratification, to help them achieve better social, environmental outcomes. So, that can mean any number of things in different sectors. It's a really interesting question, because if you're from a developed country, people say development and they mean, helping poor countries. But if you're in a developing country, it's just policy, right? And so there is sort of this funny thing that happens. And depending on, who you're talking to, people have different perceptions of what that might be. But as far as the World Bank is concerned, it's got specifically to do with foreign aid coming in from developed countries to countries that have a lower income. Right, so of this $81 billion in climate finance, just taking the World Bank as an example, and as of 3 years ago, only 0.1% of our health investments considered climate change, right? So that's pretty abysmal. The World Bank annual health portfolio is usually about $2.5 billion. This year it's going to be bigger. It's going to be almost $4.5 billion. And I'll sort of describe what we've done in recent years to change this. But as of 2015, when we started this program, it was almost nothing considered climate change. That's a big problem. So how are we approaching climate change and health? What are we doing within the institution, and how are we working with other actors to try and fix this? So there's two sides, right? There's threats. Climate change threatens health, and then poor health, of course, threatens development. All of these things are connected. You know, environment, human health, economies, they don't work in silos. And then there are the opportunities. We work very much on universal health coverage, extending that to all the countries of the world. Climate change also is a World Bank priority. And considering climate change in this universal health coverage agenda is now a priority, because we think we can improve health systems and improve development outcomes in countries across sectors. So entry points. There's a few entry points that we use. Again, we're not necessarily a logical player in this space, because we are a bank. We focus on finance and economics. So in order to get our stakeholders involved, we need to make an economic case for these climate change health connections. But we're also a development institution, and many within the institution care about health, as it is a fundamental indicator of development. And then thirdly, but not least importantly, it's important for us to work directly with our client countries, which are the developing countries of the world. So the first entry point, finance, right? So there are a lot of numbers out there. We've got a website that has a full list of these, but there have been some studies that suggest that direct damage costs on health from climate change will be as much as $12 billion by 2030, and that actually was just for a small set of countries, right? So we have pretty weak numbers on this because it's so difficult to do a global study looking at health and climate impacts. If you think about the causal chains going from climate change down to changing environments to discrete impacts and how all that fits together. We tried to do it for a few things, and there are a few cool studies out of Columbia and Harvard and UCL to look at this, but it's really a challenge. And then just some more numbers, sort of looking at different slices of this. Here's one connected to disasters in the US, and then labor productivity losses from heat. This heat story is quite interesting because it's going to also be very variable by country. In countries where you have a lot of agricultural workers, of course, there's going to be direct impacts on heat-related health issues. There's been some new research coming out about relationships to chronic kidney disease, which is kind of cool. So folks get dehydrated and they have long-term kidney disease associated with too much heat exposure. And then in other countries, you have a lot of factory workers, and there's a big gender component to that as well, because the factory workers tend to be women, and you can see heat-related health impacts there. So just breaking it down and understanding all of these things put together. Another entry point is the health indicators. We've seen this a few times already, but just to show that there are all of these different kinds of health impacts. A lot of things that people get sick from can in some ways be connected to climate and environment. And then this last entry point is country engagement. So recently the UNFCCC has set up this system of nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And what these are country commitments to reducing the impact of climate change. And so what it is, it's like a little climate action plan for every country, where they say, all right, this is what we're going to do to decrease the global threat of climate change. But they also very often articulate what the impacts are in the countries themselves. And of these countries, 65.8% articulated health as being something that they're concerned about. That's really important. That's something that the international community can't ignore. If 66% of countries around the world say that health and climate change are important for them, the governments of the world and development agencies need to take notice. What's interesting though, if you look at this map, the blue ones are the ones that articulate it, which are all the countries that stand to be most impacted by climate change, and then the other ones, the US and Europe, don't, which is telling and unfortunate. So what are we doing down the street? We're doing these things, building a plan, we're identifying the areas that we should be working in. We work in all the countries of the world, so where should we focus first? We're piloting country-level interventions to see what works at a small scale so we can scale up. We are preparing the health sector, and trying to establish multi-sectoral collaborations. And we are building partnerships because we recognize that we can't do it all on our own. So building a plan. We went through this process. It was painful, to describe it. It was working within the institution to get people to understand what climate change and health impacts are and establish a strategy across these different sectors. And so this required getting development experts and economists within the institution to recognize the health impacts of climate change, and then trying to align some kind of thinking about that, and then establish indicators and commitments going forward. So one of the things that we did was we established that by 2020, 20% of World Bank health investments would include climate change. And this was from a starting point of 0.1%, right? And trying to get 20% of our health investments of a $4.5 billion portfolio to consider climate is no small task. But I'll save that for the end, keep you in suspense, so you know what we're talking. And this is just sort of what this thing looks like. It's an institutional strategy. It's not that exciting, but it's a necessary part of the process, which is the same in any institution, whether it be a university or another multilateral or a private company. You've got to sort of map out your strategy and then go for it. And we're sort of loosely adhering to this, and we've got an Excel sheet with deadlines and timetables, but it's, there's some flexibility as well. And this is just some more bureaucratic junk and timelines and so on.
My question.
Yeah.
So it's a little unclear to me, and I'm sure it's very clear to you. When you're talking about integrating issues around climate change and health, and that goal is making me ask this question in particular at the
Yeah,
moment.
which this here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are you thinking at only outcomes, so impacts of greenhouse gas, or also on mitigation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's notoriously difficult to measure health impacts within a development institution because what are you measuring, right? And what's the time frame? Are you measuring, lives lost that have been averted, or are you measuring overall improved health outcomes, or are you measuring some kind of economic metric, or are you measuring dollars mobilized? Really, really difficult, and it's not something that you can do within a matter of years. It usually takes many years to, understand what kind of impact you're having. Within the institution, how we're measuring our success is by how linked it is to broader strategies and how other investments are taking into consideration the impacts of climate change on health. Because if we're to wait for the absolute improvement of health outcomes that have been, averted because of climate change, we're never going to get there. So it's about getting people to understand, sort of getting, this kind of language in the lending documents, and then counting the dollars that have been mobilized for this. And then, granted, there's a whole other sort of step in that, and it's about monitoring that and making sure that people are doing their jobs properly, and there are appropriate environmental and social safeguards to ensure that these aren't having a negative impact, more than they would have been without this built in. So it's a very complex thing, and there's been much discourse written in the development literature about how to measure outcomes. And for us, it's just about getting these ideas out there and getting people to understand, and having some kind of impact on investment. Yes.
My question is a little more basic. Do you have to function like a bank where you have to show a return on investment, and where does your monies come from? What's hidden in that is, are you politically vulnerable?
All that, yeah. So, our money comes from different ways. So we have these World Bank bonds that have been in existence for a long time, and we use that for our loans that go out the door. And so countries pay back their loans. There's interest, of course, and so it's regenerating like a bank. And the idea is that countries pay back their loans. They're pretty good at doing so, because the point is that countries become wealthier and they become more stable and secure, and so that generates revenue, which can then be invested back in countries. There's a separate tranche of funding that is it's grant funding, and that's replenished every few years. And it's the wealthier countries in the world that pitch into this fund, and that $20 or so billion goes to developing countries just as sort of no interest, it's just to do projects. And as countries graduate from this scheme, as they increase their GDP and income levels, they become ineligible for receiving World Bank grants and loans. and then eventually they can move to become donors as well, pitch into this fund to fund other developing countries.
Can I ask, sorry, can I
Yep.
ask a follow-up question? So to maybe just be more concrete about it, so you're doing these pilot projects in countries maybe you've already selected or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
So as you move forward thinking about that, and you're trying to integrate this discourse and raise awareness, which I know is really, really hard.
Yes.
Is a thing unto itself. Is it that you will be able to influence the way that the bank is funding, say, new energy infrastructure? Or is it that you're mainly focusing on the health sector and trying to expand that in order to accommodate changing health risks?
Yeah, we're doing both.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have a strategy that's focused specifically on the health department, but then we also have these collaborations with everyone else in the institution. And we think the biggest bang for our buck will be working with the social and environmental safeguards folks there, who review projects, before they go
Okay.
forward and so on, to make sure that these boxes are ticked and that we're covering all the bases.
Got it, thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, where, if anywhere, do you get any help from the International Monetary Fund in developing your plan?
Yeah, a little bit. So, the bank and the IMF are sister institutions, and they set monetary and economic policy, and they have got a lot of cool economists there. Cool in parentheses. Some of them are kind of interesting. Nobody works in the IMF here, I guess. Favorite pastime of the economists, of course. But yes, we work at different scales. I mean, the IMF doesn't provide resources to developing countries in the same way that we do. They'll come in and they'll bail out a country who is in complete economic collapse and give Greece $1 trillion or something. But we do collaborate on some things in this agenda. So for example, there's been some really great work that's been done on carbon pricing, the social value of carbon. And until recently, health was not a part of that calculus. Now, it is increasingly so under one of the IMF frameworks. So, it's about this kind of technical collaboration in getting these guys aware of these issues, for sort of a broader economic and financial impact. Yes?
Within the bank, how much room for collaboration exists for people to kind of come together, perhaps have discussions at the water cooler, and then start working on a pilot?
Yeah, a fair bit. I mean, the bank is a very social and political institution, and so there are a fair degree of people there that have some kind of technical expertise, but it's also, it's just a lot about, talking at the water cooler, having drinks, there's some opportunity for cross-pollination, absolutely doing that.
But, so secondary question to that, of those pilots to start, how often do they get to finish? Because I know often I've seen that people end up having lots of other commitments, they're spread thin, and even though it's a great idea and they have a great rapport with other colleagues, things just kind of fall to the periphery and that pilot
Yeah,
ends up
I mean, that
stranded.
can be. I mean, if something becomes a formalized part of the bank lending program, and there's a lot of momentum behind that, I mean, it takes years to bring our project to board. It's going to be a $100 million investment or $300 million or something. It takes several years and dozens of people to get that loan actualized. And so if it gets to that point, then absolutely it's moving forward, regardless of who's running the project. And so there are these little sort of sparks of collaboration all over the place, and sometimes those will turn into a fire, but it really is variable by the project. Yeah. Talk about some of those in the next slides here. So what else have we done? We've identified geographies for action. So we did a little analysis looking at some of the different vulnerability indices out there of where health and climate change might be a problem. And so what we found was not surprising. I apologize for the acronyms. FCV is the bank categorization of fragility, conflict, or violence countries. And then 95% of African countries are highly vulnerable to climate change, which is not surprising. But the reason that this is important is because this gives us an entry point into working with ministries of finance or ministries of health or ministries of environment in countries. If we go and meet a health minister from the DRC, say, and we have this kind of research to back up discussions around a new loan focused on a health and climate dimension, it's useful, right? Because data speaks regardless of what field you're in. And this is just sort of an extraction of this, sort of highlighting where these things are a problem. And we did a couple different categories of impact. This one has to do with emissions. So where you have high air pollution impacts that are also associated with carbon emissions. All right, so piloting country level interventions. So as well as developing a sort of high level policy investment framework sort of thing, we also wanted to try this out in countries to make sure that what we were doing was applicable and had some utility. First country we did this in was Mozambique. Within this Mozambique project, we had a little bit of money, maybe it was $300,000 or $400,000 to just go and test some of these things out to see what could be done in the future. And the first thing that we learned was that this was going to be more complicated than we thought it was, which I guess is always the case with development work. And we had our idea, like, all right, we're going to set up this climate change health action plan, and we're going to come out with a set of recommendations, and that's going to be it. Well, the Mozambican government didn't like that idea. They had other programs going on. They were developing protocols for extreme weather. They had an environmental action plan. And so we couldn't do it the way that we wanted to do it, which is actually really good because it forced us to listen to the government of Mozambique and be more useful to them. Rather than creating some report that was only going to be useful to people within the institution, we then had to reconstruct and try to create something that could be used for folks in Mozambique in different ministries and departments that would stand alone outside of our work. So what we did was we advised on these things. They were creating these emergency protocols, and a lot of this has to do with climate change responsiveness, and so we helped put health in there. So embedding the climate health considerations into ongoing work. There was extreme weather action plan as well, again, making sure that health was represented in this. We did sort of get to do a climate change and health action plan, but this was, I think, probably the least useful thing to folks in Mozambique. We also found that it was complex because there were other development partners already working in Mozambique. The WHO was there, USAID was there, the WMO was there, DFID was there, and these folks were working on different pieces of climate change and health development projects. And people were initially like, what do you guys, we've got this covered, we don't need you here. We don't need the World Bank coming in with your money and messing things up, we've already got our stream of work. And to be fair, they were also probably kind of right. So there's different sensitivities of engaging with stakeholders and making sure that you're collaborating and not stepping on toes. But it's incredibly difficult, both for reasons of institutional strategies, but then also just personalities, right? Somebody's got a good idea and they've been doing it for a long time, and then you come in and you want to mess it up. So you got to be sensitive to that. And then here's just more about this, doing a vulnerability analysis, always the first step in doing a climate health assessment. And then this, do you want to say something about this? Okay, so this is Susan's research. She was working with the bank, and they were linking up health and climate change and cook stoves, right? Because there's this connection between cook stoves that are dirty and air pollution and climate change. And the takeaway, I got this right, in a little while since I read the report, was that if you have better cook stoves, you result in better health outcomes and reduce pollution, right? So that's great. And then also we've got this amazing peer-reviewed paper that's associated with this project, which again is really important because it validates our work, because it's been reviewed by the Academy as well. And it's not just a bunch of development guys out there with their hundreds of millions of dollars. It's actually been done by people that know the subject matter. So thank you for that, really great. And good work is appreciated within the institution. You have senior levels of management which understand this and they appreciate it and think, all right, great, this will validate it, we can do more of this moving forward. All right, so moving on. How much time do I have left here? 10 minutes, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll get moving then. So we have developed this approach for conducting climate change and health diagnostics in any country. And what that is, it's like the WHO conducts these as well, where you look at the risks of climate change and health, and then you draw a direct line to the kinds of opportunities and we as the World Bank investments that we can make. And so we are piloting this in 2 countries. We haven't started Bangladesh yet, but we've just finished Madagascar. So if anyone's been to Madagascar, this is what it looks like. This is henna. Really lovely city, little bit of air pollution, variable by day of course, but really great place. You know, the sun comes up, it's nice, there's donkeys in the street, it's a good little market, good breakfast, got lemurs outside the city, which are super adorable, of course. But then it also looks like this, you know, right through the center of the city. You've got this sort of this open sewer and people that are sort of sitting around surrounded by trash, and there's air pollution everywhere, and then you go outside the city and on the coast, and you have sharks that have been finned, and all sorts of unfortunate environmental practices, you know, which are associated with livelihoods and, you know, people trying to make some money, but that also can be quite destructive to the environment. So what we did was we linked up with this new World Bank investment. It's a nutrition program, and this is part of the multi-phase programmatic approach. It's a stupid bureaucratic thing. But it's a $100 million project that was actually increased to $200 million. So a $200 million program for safeguarding nutrition in parts of Madagascar. And we looked at this thing and we thought, all right, it's great, but we need to find a way to make this more climate smart. We need to highlight how the project dimensions can address climate change or can be more responsive to climate change. So if the folks that are running this program are investing in a certain area, we need to make sure that that area is the precise geographic location where they should be investing, given projected climate impacts. So what we did was we established this approach. Again, this is just sort of a process here, but you know, you sort of get together with some smart folks, you think about how this thing might unfold, you go to the country, you conduct a workshop, meet with as many people as you can in Ministry of Health, Environment, Meteorology, NGOs in the area, other investment banks, other stakeholders. You go out, you conduct site visits, you go to rainforests, you go to factories, then you bring that smart group of people back together again, who are both people that are working in country and are country experts, as well as international finance experts, and you make a list of recommendations to inform the investment. And then you go back one final time and have this workshop again with country stakeholders and say, how does this look? And they say it doesn't look that good. And so you go back and you do it again, and then you bring it back and you say, how does this look? And they're like, it's a little better. And then you do that a few more times, like, all right, this is great. And then what you do is you use that to impact the structure of the loan. So this loan that went to board, and this is just one of the meetings that we had with the folks in Madagascar, we were able to increase the climate sensitivity of this project up from 0% climate sensitive to as much as like 20 or 25% climate sensitive, which is actually a thing. I mean, it might not sound like much, what's that mean, 20% climate sensitivity? But what it means is that given the threat of climate change in certain geographies and certain kinds of impacts, those are now considered. So it should be a much more climate smart investment. And these are the 5 categories of health-related priorities that we made for this nutrition project. And you'll see that it's not just nutrition, but there's water-related illness, extreme events, vector-borne disease, air pollution. Some of these things can be captured within this broader, this more narrow nutrition-focused lending program. But then also, we looked at the $700 million portfolio that exists in Madagascar and made recommendations for other kinds of investments as well. So this nutrition project was our entry point, but then we've used that to scale up and make recommendations for other World Bank investments that are on energy or infrastructure or whatever. Again, to raise awareness for it and to get that into future lending, which will translate into things. We are in the health sector. We developed this new field of climate smart healthcare. If any of you heard climate smart agriculture, it's sort of the same thing but for the health sector. And there's 2 dimensions of this. There's low carbon and resilience dimensions. So making sure that the health sector is cleaner, working with different certification agencies, and then of course the resilience aspect of it, making sure that hospital and health systems are, again, positioned in the right place and aren't going to sort of feel the impacts of climate change, whether it be storms, or the health systems are prepared with the right kinds of medications to increase disease burden, and then also just getting people to understand and get them trained up is really important. So it's our hope that in the future, we won't even need to use this term anymore, climate smart healthcare, because healthcare will just be climate smart. But in the meantime, we need to start someplace and get people to understand these connections. And this is just a Venn diagram of how this works, pretty basic. And then just some lists of low carbon strategies, and then lists of resilient strategies, and all of this is online, you're able to look into it. And then here we are, just one of our site visits to the hospital, trying to suss out if this will, this is sort of going to be resilient in the face of climate change. And this particular facility was actually not so resilient. Very prone to flooding, much like happened in this country. The generators were placed below flood level. So one of the recommendations, of course, don't put the generators below flood level, particularly if you're in an area that's going to be prone to coastal flooding in the future. This is just a representation of the World Bank's lending portfolio. So a couple $1 billion in health, $7.5 billion in environment, $3 billion annually in agriculture, and $10.5 billion in climate-specific stuff. And I just put this up here as a representation of how we're kind of working multi-sectorally. There are these climate change and health connections to food, and then of course to environment. I mean, I think Ebola was probably a good example of this. I'm not connecting Ebola to climate change, but I'm saying that there's this clear linkage between vector-borne diseases and deforestation and climate impacts and how this is all related. And just keeping this conversation going amongst people within the institution and externally to help them understand how health and environmental systems are all linked. We also have big programs on disaster risk screening to make sure that all of our projects are screened for potential disaster risks, which of course is associated with climate change. We've got this new website for focusing on disaster recovery. You'll see that health is prominently featured there as one of the categories of work. Post-disaster checklist, again, we've been very engaged with the disaster sector at the World Bank, which is its own sort of unique organization within the institution for various reasons. But again, making sure that health and climate change are synced up with that. This is an example of some of the projects we have. We're running some cool projects with the University of Exeter. They've got a great program linking oceans to human health and well-being and how that's connected to climate change as well, and how coastal erosion can undermine that, or loss of fisheries can undermine health. But again, sort of an illustration of how we're really dependent upon what's going on in the academy, which is great. And then we're also working with other donors. This is just the front page of a long report that we did with the foundation community, trying to get them to mobilize some of their funds. So if we, as a development community, the international organization world, have X billion of dollars to invest, the foundation community also has a lot of cash, and they can come in at a different level. Whereas we primarily work with government, foundations may be working with NGOs or with individuals in the private sector to catalyze different kinds of projects. So important not to exclude them. So what's the overall impact? Well, the dial has moved, right? So we went from having 0.1% of health projects sensitive to climate change to more than 20% as of this year. I just had a meeting with our portfolio manager last week, and they review all the projects. And so we have made an impact. We've reached that 20% target already. We still have 2 years to go by 2020, so we're readjusting. Hopefully we can get that at 30%. We'll see. We think that our work has leveraged other funders. Wellcome Trust, Rockefeller Foundation, a number of small foundations, Nordic Development Fund, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank are all starting programs in health and climate following the impact that we've had. There are many countries that have new climate change and health strategies, and we're helping to further that along, working with WHO. And we know this because people and projects are coming back to us and they're asking us for more. What can we do? And we say, all right, well, we have to work on this together. Midterm impact projections, I'm certain that more funding will be allocated to this, both from our institution, but a lot of our partner institutions as well. Countries are beginning to integrate climate change and health more. It's great across ministries. Considerations will become more mainstream in the health sector, and I think that's true in this country as well, as hospitals begin to take notice. It's really important. I think that we'll also begin to see economic metrics looking at health and climate co-benefits and impacts, like this stuff that's coming out of the IMF, or there's a group at Oxford doing an economic analysis associated with planetary health, which is this broader umbrella construct for climate change and health, biodiversity and health, pollution and health, and any of these things. Longer term impact projections, I think that countries will establish more multidisciplinary programs, more working groups that address climate change and health. Climate sensitive disease impacts will drop in some countries. This is all really optimistic, by the way, but hopefully that's going to happen. And then again, carbon pricing will shift as a result of people beginning to understand these health impacts. So quickly, We done? Yeah. All right, we can be done. This is just some of the other stuff we have going on at the bank that's sort of related to climate change and health. Yeah, we need more money, more people working on this, more countries involved. World Bank's a very political place to work. You know, it's kind of interesting.